Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome a member of the Belcher String Quartet, Krzysztof Horszalski. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Krzysztof. It took me a long time to practice that. Thank you so much.
I'm very impressed. Beautiful.
We were or are looking forward to the complete cycle of the Beethoven quartets, which the Belcher Quartet was going to perform in November. We still hope that this can happen, but, difficult times, right? So what has the quartet been doing in these times? I guess many of your concerts have been also cancelled over the last 6 months or so.
Yes, we had about 40 concerts cancelled. Well, since March, basically, we hardly played at all. We, for the first 3 months, we didn't see each other, obviously, also because we live in different countries. I live in Germany and my colleagues live in France. So for quite a long time, the borders were actually closed, so we couldn't even rehearse. And then when the borders reopened, it was also not entirely sure whether we would be allowed to cross them, because you really had to have a legitimate reason to cross the border, and it wasn't sure whether rehearsing string quartets was legitimate enough. But at the beginning of June, we finally met. So having been on a real high at the beginning of March, when we played our, I think, third and fourth Beethoven cycle concerts at the Wigmore Hall in London, and feeling that we are really, this is really the best time in our musical life, because there's nothing better than Beethoven string quartets, really. And having played them and recorded them some years ago, and now having returned to them, and it just felt like we were really entering a new phase in our relationship with this music, and it was really a wonderful time. And suddenly, the whole thing stopped, and of course, it had huge implications for us on many levels. Our lives completely changed, like your lives, like everyone's lives. We are all in this situation all over the world. And yes, we simply didn't know, and to be honest, we still don't know what future will bring. We were so looking forward to coming to Hong Kong and playing all of them for you, and we still hope that this may happen, but obviously we don't know.
Well, I think we would definitely have to get you here at some point.
Well, we really would love to do that, so hopefully we will.
But you have played the quartets, the cycle recently, right? You've come back onto the stage with
yes.
A few concerts.
So in the summer in Europe, some concerts started to happen, and some festivals decided to take the risk and not to give up, and to continue presenting concerts to socially distanced audiences. Very different feeling, really, for us. But yes, we played our very first concert after the period of isolation was in June. We played one concert in Dortmund. It was a very nice concert because it's a shared cycle with the Quatuor Eben, who are our friends, and it was wonderful to, first of all, to be playing together again, but also to be joined by our colleagues from another quartet that we love and admire, and to be able to to spend this time together also was special. So that was the first concert we played, and it was very strange because the hall was practically empty. There were very few people sitting in the hall, so it did feel strange from that point of view. Then we had another break, and then at the beginning of August we met again to rehearse for several weeks, to bring back the rest of the cycle, because then we went to Warsaw, to the Chopin Festival there, where again, very courageously, they put on all these concerts in the Philharmonic Hall in Warsaw, which is a wonderful hall, and it's particularly moving for me because this is my hometown. So very moving that we were able to do the cycle there. We had already performed 2 of the 6 concerts the previous summer, so we had 4 left, and we performed them all in 5 days, and that was very special. Again, very strange feeling from the audience. Everyone's faces covered with masks, and not the same.
From that high in the Wigmore Hall, and then that hiatus, and then having to come back again, sort of almost restructure yourselves, right, in a completely new situation. I mean, did the concerts, apart from feeling strange because of the audience, also give a new feeling to the way you were playing the Beethoven cycle?
I think so. I think when we are in the full swing of rehearsing and we're preparations for concerts which had been previously very carefully planned, and we aim for a certain level of just stability and a kind of athleticism on stage, which comes with just doing it regularly. You know, it's to a certain extent, it's also our profession has a certain sportive element in just keeping up this stamina of being on stage, and the ability to deal with the stress of being on stage, and the ability to deal with the amount of repertoire we have in our hands. And in this particular case, it's very special because we rarely have so many pieces on the go at the same time as during a Beethoven year. It's 16 quartets. Normally we during a season we don't play more than 9 quartets, and we make this exception only when we play Beethoven cycles because it's because they are worth the effort, and also we feel that we know them. We have grown to know them relatively well, although each time we return to them, we discover new things in them. So the difference, I think, in the feeling is that we feel less stable. I think we feel more vulnerable on stage. We are. I think we are. Like I said, we are used to a greater degree of stability between us. But I think that perhaps this is quite helpful in a way in playing Beethoven, because this music is dangerous. It's meant to be dangerous. And it's meant to be unstable. It's meant to destabilize the listener. It's meant to shake us to the core. And I think that perhaps in this state of being destabilized, we are able to express something almost unknowing, not aware of it. Something else in this music. I'm hoping that that's the case, because it's very moving for us also, to be in a situation where we have no sense of security. We don't know what will happen. We don't know whether the concert we are playing tonight is not the last concert before the next lockdown, and it's a new feeling, and it renders us, I think, more alive and more aware of our vulnerability and of the and I think that's perhaps good in many ways.
Well, when I think of a lot of the Beethoven quartets, there's a very strong sense of vulnerability in the music. I mean, something like the Cavatina, the middle of it, where it's beklempt, almost everything is exposed, right? In terms of feeling, but also I think just in the texture of the quartet itself. So in a way, that kind of risk, that kind of vulnerability is very Beethovenian, particularly the late Beethoven, right? You have that. So I would imagine that there is a kind of a heightened vulnerability and risk involved. Performance. It's really amazing. But what is it like, I mean, doing this marathon? I mean, it's 16 very, concentrated, very long, some of them, these quartets. I mean, it must not just require, physical stamina, but the mental stamina, everything. I mean, what is it like to do the cycle? Because not many quartets would be brave enough to do this.
Well, it's, of course, it's an incredible undertaking. It requires, first of all, enormous amount of rehearsing and no degree of familiarity with this music prevents us from having to rehearse a lot because of the sheer size of this repertoire of this cycle, and the technical demands, and the intensity. Because well, yes, first I think that this is maybe in a way the most important thing, that there's a degree of intensity in this music that requires a total commitment on all levels, not just the musical level, but it's a kind of all-consuming state that you reach when you enter these quartets. And of course, in order to be able to do that, in order to be able to give yourself with this kind of level of abandon, the preparation, the technical preparation, the mental preparation, the mutual understanding of what we want to say has got to reach a level where we can abandon ourselves in a way, of course, in a controlled manner. But yes, well, I think what makes Beethoven's music unique is that I have a feeling that it engages not just the sort of cultured, cultivated musical side of our beings, but it really draws from the most raw parts of each of our lives, and it, of course, it needs to be filtered somehow into a coherent vision and message, but at the same time it has to retain this rawness. Without it, I think this music cannot really exist. So I think that's maybe what is the most unique thing about playing a full Beethoven cycle, is that you are living on a kind of level of intensity that is almost unbearable. The level of intimacy, the level of violence, the level of tenderness. Everything is extreme. Everything is extreme. There are no. There's nothing in this music that is moderate in its content.
Right, it's like a roller coaster, really.
Yeah.
In many ways. I was just wondering, which of the quartets would be the most challenging for the Belsior Quartet? I mean, which quartet would really push you to the edge of what you want to express, or what you think is capable, or where, just pushing you beyond your comfort zone?
Well, the one that really pushes you out of the comfort zone is more than any others, I suppose, is the Opus 130 with the Grosse Fugue as the finale. But having said that, I have a feeling that it's a piece that we know so well and have played so much during the last decades that perhaps it's not as challenging for me. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I have a feeling that my colleagues will share this view. Then, for instance, the Opus 132 and 135, which are more enigmatic. They're not as they're perhaps not, well, the Opus 132 is very much a tour de force in a similar way to the great Opus 130, but that's not really the difficulty. For me, the difficulty was with this quartet is the level of spiritual the spiritual heights that it inhabits are just such that it's a piece that we've been playing for years, but I'm never sure that we're really there yet. And I have a feeling that with each return we progress, but there's clearly further to go. And the Opus 135, in the fact that it's so enigmatic, and there's this cohabitation of the greatest depth and honesty with music that is also quite well. There's a sort of a sense of humor, dry sense of humor in it that is difficult to qualify. It's difficult to know how to what is the final message of his last quartet.
Right. It seems so deep and philosophical.
What try to say with it?
Yeah,
it's very, very, very difficult, and in the end, there's a big question mark, and perhaps that's the intention. But I think these are the quartets where I think there's a level of maturity that everyone needs to reach to catch up with them. I'm not entirely sure that we are there yet. The Opus 130 with the Grosse Fuge is just an all-out revolution, and we relish it because I think in each one of us there is this desire to break free from all bounds and to be to a certain degree anarchistic, and I think that the Grosse Fuge unleashes this tendency and helps us express it, and I think it comes naturally to us. But there are different levels of this music, different realms that this music takes us to, and some of them are more elusive than others.
So in your rehearsals, do you talk about all this stuff? And when you play the Heilige Dankesang, do you say, oh my gosh, how do we arrive at a spiritual state, or the Grosse Fuge? How do we become seemingly more kind of violent, or to express that kind of struggle? I mean, do you talk about this and then try and say, how do we make this kind of sound or noise that we have to produce?
Funnily enough, when we rehearse, we are so in the music that we rarely zoom out and talk about these things in a non-musical way. Perhaps that's a certain limitation of ours. I don't know. It's difficult to say because when you are so immersed in the music, you are dealing with just with the sound, with the musical matter, and of course, at the back of our minds is the content, what this music expresses. But we are so in the moment, so involved and wrapped in just the sheer matter that the music presents, that I think we rarely have such conversations. Only maybe later on these discussions arise, but not really. Midst rehearsal, it doesn't really happen.
Right.
I don't know. It's difficult to see how four musicians who are holding their instruments and just looking for the right sound, that they start making these big leaps of imagination, and it sometimes happens, and sometimes it is someone has a certain image in mind and shares it with the others. I think it can be helpful. But sometimes, you say something that you think is very perceptive in that kind of way, and you look, your colleagues look at you and say to you, okay, but that's fine. But what do you actually mean? What does it mean for us? So sometimes it's better to stay away from these big images and just focus on, because we sort of understand each other without words. So when we start using, sometimes I have a feeling that when we start resorting to words, misunderstandings can occur, because we rely on something that is commonly considered as the most useful means of communicating, but actually between four musicians who've been doing this for 25 years, sometimes words may be even unhelpful.
Yeah, well, it's better to speak through music, I guess. I mean, the journey actually from the first quartet to say something like the Grosse Fuge is bizarre, right? Because you begin with something that seems so convivial, so friendly, and it is like almost opera buffa. People are just talking. It's almost Mozartian in the first movement of the first quartet, and then the last movement of, say, originally of Opus 130. I mean, you are in an area where you feel that the music has, well, it's no longer friendly. Let's put it this way. This is no longer for intelligent people conversing. It's really almost like a kind of violent, chaotic structure. Let's put it that way. So do you, as a quartet, decide to play Beethoven in that kind of more disunited way as part of your aesthetic of playing Beethoven? Because some quartets prefer to keep things kind of more under control. Then other quartets want to really let rip and show the kind of eruptions and ruptures that happen in this music when it gets to that kind of stage.
Well, it's perhaps difficult to define what our position in this spectrum is, because we don't premeditate how what we're going to do with this music. We just respond to it the way we feel. I think it's easier for our audiences to say. But for instance, I can already say that yes, the first quartet begins in a very convivial way. But when you look at the slow movement of the Opus 18 number 1, what happens there is already not far from the outrages of his later style. And in some ways, I would say that there's a desperation and violence in that movement that he almost never replicated. It's absolutely extraordinary. In those early pieces where he was, only basically following in the footsteps of Haydn and Mozart, and yet he had something so distinctively original to say. And so there's an interesting story about that quartet, is that when he presented the book of his Opus 18s to Haydn looked at them, and the Opus 18 number 1, which then became the quartet that the F major quartet, which became the Opus 18 number 1, he had reservations about, and he encouraged Beethoven not to put it as number 1 in the book. That was the one piece that he really wasn't sure about. And what did Beethoven do? Of course, he said, "Okay, well, that's a proof to me that he's just envious about this quartet, and this will be my first quartet."
It's true. I mean, that movement, that second movement, I mean, it could not be written by Haydn or Mozart. There is a voice there that is so original and so powerful. This is the one possibly about Romeo and Juliet and that sort of tomb. So it is a very dramatic, very Beethovenian type of expression.
What is extraordinary in this music, in this particular movement, is not only the level of drama and outright violence that occurs in it, but also the expressive powers of silence. That I actually cannot think of another piece of music that uses silence in such a way. I honestly cannot think of another piece in Beethoven's output, and I would be really I couldn't think of another composer that did something like this. So this is completely groundbreaking from the word go. Of course, surrounded by convivial music. But at the same time, I have a feeling that from the beginning, if you really look into this music, you see that Beethoven inherited this language, and from the beginning, he's showing us its limitations. He's constantly poking fun at his tools. He's constantly distorting them, or just. It's never. There's always a sort of a second degree to this music. Even here, that he's not really following in the footsteps of Haydn and Mozart. He's just showing us what he has in his hands and what he will have to do in order to transform himself and transform the music. So in a way, it's all there already in the Opus 18s, I think, and not to mention. The Opus 18 number 6 with the introduction to the finale and La Malinconia. It's another example of music that looks forward to the 20th century. In Western music, the composer let the listener into his soul, the way Beethoven does in La Malinconia. It's without, in my view, completely without precedence. So yes, of course, there's a huge journey between the Opus 18s and the late quartets, but at the same time, the seeds are sown very early on, and I think it's very important to recognize it.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, Beethoven's creative character remained more or less the same, right? That kind of poking at things, that constant irony, or even irony of ironies, trying to kind of figure out where to push the music forward and questioning everything, every form, and even, I guess, trying to outwit Haydn in many ways. Now, I know that you are a quartet player because of Beethoven. I mean, if it wasn't for Beethoven, you wouldn't be doing this. Is that right?
Possibly, quite possibly. I mean, I love other, great string quartets by other composers. Schubert is also a great love of mine, and Mozart and Haydn. But yes, I mean, there's something about this music that speaks to me, and I think to my colleagues as well. I'm speaking for all of us in a way that is stronger than even those great masters.
Was there a particular Beethoven quartet, sort of aha moment? I says, I've got to be a viola player in a quartet to play this music.
Well, yes, actually, it's interesting that I came to Beethoven quartets relatively late. I was already actually a quartet player, a student quartet player, and I certainly didn't know the late quartets. And I remember that on my very first visit to Berlin, I think it was 1994, I went into a CD shop. I mean, that was my addiction. Wherever I was in the world, the first steps I took were usually to a CD shop. And this was a CD shop in the former East Berlin, recently opened big, they still adapt those, in those days, they had big CD shops. And there was this big classical section. And in it, I saw a box of late Beethoven quartets played by the Alban Berg Quartet. And I was a student. I had no money at the time. It was, for me, to buy CDs was a really, and to buy a big box of CDs was already, a big thing. But the label on this box was the price was incredibly low. So I took it to the cashier and I paid for it. And I'm convinced to this day that this was just a matter of someone putting the wrong price label on the CD, because it was not possible for it to be so cheap. And I went home and I opened this box and I put on the Opus 131. And that was the moment when I realized that there's nothing greater. So I would have come across this quartet sooner or later, but this trip to the CD shop in Berlin, in former East Berlin, where I think things were pretty disorganized, was very fateful, I think, for me. And it's the Opus 131 that I know also that Antoine, our cellist, also finds the quartet that changed his life. So we certainly have a lot in common already. We had already a lot in common before we met.
I remember that those recordings, the Alban Berg recordings, they're great recordings. I mean, I noticed you have your Amadeus String Quartet poster behind you. I mean, do you also trace, as it were, a kind of heritage with quartets, and you listen to these quartets and try to sort of position yourself within a certain tradition?
Not deliberately, not consciously, but obviously we are very much influenced by these quartets. We had our first teachers were the members of the Amadeus Quartet and then the Alban Berg Quartet. That was a kind of fulfillment of our dream, coming from that visit to the CD shop when I heard the Alban Berg Quartet play Beethoven. It changed my life. And when the Belcher Quartet formed, the first thing that we wanted to do was to meet them and to play for them, and we were able to do that. And of course, then they remained our mentors for years. And what's wonderful about these people, both the Amadeus and the Alban Berg Quartet, is that they were very thorough in how they transmitted their understanding and their aesthetic and their understanding of this music. But at the same time, they, I think, acknowledged our own personalities, and I think very much encouraged us to develop. You know, there was nothing dogmatic about their style of teaching, and so the result is, I think, that when I listen now to the recordings of the Amadeus Quartet and the Alban Berg Quartet, I recognize in them qualities that we will never reach. That are just, you know, so much their own, in the sense of their own style, their own sound. That these are things that are so personal that cannot really be copied and shouldn't be copied. But I see how different we are from them. I recognize that, and in a way, I'm, you know, my gratitude to them for allowing us to develop in that different ways is, and for the wisdom to do that, because for me that's what really great mentoring, great teaching is about. It's not to tell people how you play it, but to help them find their own way of doing it, and that was our path with them.
Well, it's great to hear that you have this kind of legacy at the same time, this ability to develop. And I was going to ask you a question about, similar question about Beethoven, because you've done the Beethoven cycle before, right? I mean, quite a few years ago now, and now you're doing it again for, you know, the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. But obviously, when you come back to doing this cycle, it must be different. I mean, you've moved on as a quartet in the way you've, you know, thinking about music. So, is the interpretation significantly different, or is there a completely different angle that you're taking on these pieces, or have speeds and changed, or just the interpretation of certain pieces changed?
I think so. Again, you know, it's not like we sit down and say, all right, today, so it's 59 number 1. We played it in that way 8 years ago. What are we going to change? It's just all very slow and sometimes difficult to define the process that leads us to this. But clearly, many things changed. Tempi changed when I listened to a lot of what we recorded 8 years ago now, 8 years ago. A lot of the tempi are faster than how we play them now. I think that we, in some ways, when looking for a certain brilliance and a certain vivacity in the music, we missed a lot of the tension and well, a certain difficulty that is written into this music, and that is necessary that is very much part of it. So I think some of it, what I hear now, I find sounding too easy. And I noticed that, for instance, with the finale of the Opus 131, which we, in my view, recorded too fast. And if we ever recorded it again, I would very much like to address that. I think we all would. Yes, so I think that's a general feeling that the tempi, I think, are slowing down. I think we were always, from the very beginning, very drawn by contrasts in Beethoven and bringing out all of those extremes. So perhaps now this is not something that we are so focused on, because it's already natural to us. It's inside us. So I think maybe what we're looking for now more and becoming more aware of is the structure of this music. Understanding how different parts of the quartet relate to each other, how the large structure, how there are certain echoes of an idea in one movement which are present in another movement. Whether it is noticeable to our audiences, you know, that we make those connections, that we see them, whether it does anything to the vision of these quartets that we present, it's not for me to say. But that's certainly something that we are more preoccupied with right now. And certainly we are, I think, the more time we spend in our lives with this music, our awe at its greatness only increases.
I mean, there's something about Beethoven where the longer you live, the more you experience, the more the music means, right? Things to you. It's music that is not something that you can grasp, but it kind of grasps you at different moments.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. I'm just hoping very much that we can hear this at some point soon, if not all of them, at least some of them, because I'm sure that with that experience in playing this complete cycle, not just once, but several times now, you really bring a kind of richness, an interpretative richness to your performances of the Beethoven. So I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the Beethoven quartets with us. And we look forward to you and the whole quartet coming to the University of Hong Kong in the near future. Thank you very much, Chris.
We very much hope so. Thank you very much. All the best to everyone in Hong Kong.